What is up, gamers? So I had a great time making that should you buy / review style video for Scarlet Nexus, so we are back with yet another type of video in that style. So this time we have the expanded version of the 2017 hit visual novel Doki Doki Literature Club. DDLC was huge when it first came out way back when, like it was impossible to avoid anything about this game. It got a lot of attention and truly it was well deserved. For me, I think this game came out of left field, at least the expanded version. I was just looking on the Xbox store about 2 months ago, and there it was sitting there, $15 whole for a console. So this game, I think, was an interesting case and perfect for this type of series, considering that the original PC version is still there completely free. So I think that begs the great question, is it really worth buying? That answer really does depend on your history with the game and what you play on, so to start I'd like a short and sweet review of the original game, no spoilers as per usual, and let's just get right into it. So for a quick overview of the game, Doki Doki Literature Club is a visual novel revolving around the stereotypical romance plot where you, the main character, attempt to woo and romance your choice of 4 girls that you meet at your school's literature club. As the promotional material states, it is very much a psychological horror game despite its very cutesy style, and let me tell you, yeah, it's definitely quite the experience to go through. So, being a visual novel, the story is obviously the forefront and main point of the game, and there's a lot of weight on it to be successful, and again, it is safe to say that they did a very good job because the story is great. The concept is extremely unique and the execution matches it perfectly. I'm not necessarily well versed in visual novels, as this is the only one that I've ever actually played, but from what I can know and inference, I don't really think there's any other game with a story like this one that's a visual novel. It's more akin to a horror game obviously, but I don't think any other horror game has a similar story presented in this style. I was very well aware of the game when it first came out, but I never actually played it, and safe to say I'm glad that I did now. The story really is something you have to play through for yourself, and keeping the spoilers to a minimum, and you want to go in with the least amount of knowledge possible to enhance your experience. I don't want to get too deep into the story for spoiler reasons, but just know that it's amazing. The only critiques I would have is that I finished the game with quite a lot of questions, and yeah, they're not gonna get answered. I enjoy the cryptic themes and thought-provoking things that the game shows you, and how all the different machinations of the universe, in-game universe, and how it works. But for me personally, I just wanted a bit more closure and explanation to what happens. I feel like having those good big reveals is something that's important, but I'm not going to say it's entirely a detriment because some people do like that lingering mystery, especially with how the story is. Not only do you need a good story, but you need good characters for a good visual novel, and this game does that part very well. The characters are definitely one of the highest selling points of the game. They start out very tropey like the game itself, having the stereotypical romance anime archetypes like the tsundere, the childhood friend, and the shy quiet girl, but later on they end up being very multifaceted, and it's hard not to get invested in each of their stories, and how they intertwine. For most of the people who are fans of the game, it seems like a lot of the allure does come from the characters, how they act, and how they perceive them. I can commend the multiple layers of personality and nuance each character has. The game gets deeper and deeper and darker, and so do the characters and their personalities and how they act. It makes that transition from a stereotypical romance visual novel into a psychological horror game that much better. The characters ride along with that transition seamlessly. Like the rest of the game, you don't want to take the characters and how they initially act at face value. I'm one for story-based games, and these characters are definitely very good at how they complement the story and how complex they can be. Without getting into too many spoilers, their personality and how they act gets exacerbated, and again, it works hand in hand with the story and makes it what it is. Visual novels are sold off of these 2 points, and this game hits homes for both categories. Despite this topic not being as important for most visual novels, it is very impactful for this one. The audio and visual side of things has quite the impact, as the cute exterior complements the whole psychological horror impact of it. The dichotomy there is pretty cool, and I like stuff like that, having a very cutesy, unassuming exterior with a much deeper and darker interior. Without going too deep into it, a lot of the horror stuff is of course auditorial and what you see on the screen visually, and I think they do a pretty good job of those things. Most of the scares are randomized from what I remember, and it's mostly subtle with, big spikes of horror here and there, and I like the use of jump scares, which I'm also a horror fan, and I'm not really a big fan of them, so giving a commendation for jump scares in this game I think is quite the high compliment. The audio and visuals are about as good as they could be. So probably the least important part of a visual novel, but definitely a part that we need to talk about is the gameplay. So quick little overview, it's typical visual novel stuff. You click through dialogue, you read it, there's a very small amount of choices here and there, but they do have a bearing on things. And the real meat of the gameplay is the poem minigame, where you choose 20 words for a poem, and each word corresponds to a different girl in the game. Doing poems for certain girls lets you get closer to them and gets you different dialogue from all the different characters. It affects the ending you can get, and the plus version, it unlocks parts of the art book depending on if you choose a certain word or if you write a certain amount of poems for one specific girl and things like that. So we'll just have the miscellaneous critiques into this one section because I don't think there are that many, but I think they're substantial enough to talk about. So while I can praise the game for being quite some, very good game, it's not a masterpiece, and there are a few things keeping it from being at that tier. Like before, I said it feels kind of inconclusive and some things just don't make sense and you're just not going to find an answer. Again, some people can like that mystery, but for me, I'm not into it. The main character, he's kind of lame at times. I'm not a fan of how he speaks to some kind of characters, and you can't really control what he says for the most part, but again, you're kind of led on a solid track anyway. It's a hard thing to really critique too much. And my final critique isn't too serious, but again, I'll bring this up anyways. So stories with big twists and different things are hard to digest multiple times. And this is a game where it's kind of intended for you to play multiple times if you want all the endings, and if you're in the plus version, if you want all the collectibles. Usually I wouldn't see repeated viewings or playthroughs with a twist or a very big change in the story aren't bad. Like for example, the movie Saw, I think you could watch it over and over again, and while the twist doesn't hit the same, you don't take it as a detriment on subsequent viewings. But this is a game where you're probably going to play through it multiple times if you want all the endings and all the different dialogues and all that things. So not having any changes to the dialogue or anything and all the scares already being randomized, I think is a detriment to an extent. Those twists and reveals can lose their luster real fast if you're running through the game in a quick succession doing multiple playthroughs. Again, it's not a huge problem, but if you're doing multiple playthroughs, you can kind of get numb to it, and it just gets monotonous when you're just sitting there doing the skip dialogue button and you already know what's going to happen. I just wish there was some way to keep track if you've done multiple endings or something, and it changes it up just even a little bit. So now that we've been done gushing about the game and everything, it's time to get down to brass tacks. What's the difference between the free original 2017 version and the $15 expanded plus version? I'll go over each point in depth, but the differences are as follows. 13 additional tracks with a built-in soundtrack player, 6 new side stories, each with 2 parts that build onto the characters outside of the main story and your main character, HD visuals making the game look better, unlockable images for your own device or in-game computer, expanded lore through the email system in the game, and of course, a console release. So the best way I describe the Plus version is DDLC, but with an art book, soundtrack, and a small DLC. You have the soundtrack from the OG game plus a few additional tracks here, brand new to the Plus version, and you can play it all through the game's virtual machine. The art book unlocks artwork of the characters in the game and gives a little explanation of each scene as you complete certain requisites for the specific artwork. Honestly, I think it's a pretty good deal. I think it reminds me sort of like just buying a physical art book or soundtrack, but instead it's all digital, and you could download each different artwork and everything, so I think it's a nice little inclusion. And there we have the side stories, which is pretty much the meat of why it's the Plus extended version that cost money compared to the original that cost no money. So the side stories are essentially a mini DLC focusing around the main cast of girls outside of the main game and you, the protagonist. They are canon, and it's just hard to explain, and there'd be spoilers if I did, but it's canon, all of it. I think if you're invested in the story and the characters especially, they are really worth it. They give a pretty deep insight to the character's personality outside of the game and all the crazy stuff that happens within it. It also adds more gravity to what happens in the main game and helps you realize just how serious things are. It helps with your emotional attachment to each individual character, especially the one or few that you like the most. I like how it adds more context around who these people are, why they act the way they are, and what led us to where we are now. It works in reverse, as there are plenty of moments where it's like, wow, that's actually way more serious or crazy than you would initially think it was. If you don't care about the characters that much or just aren't concerned about what they do outside of the main game, then you can completely ignore it as well. They're completely optional and there's a section where you can go watch them. They can be kind of long because you can't skip them your first time around, so they can be kind of redundant, but I enjoy them. I like the characters and the added context, and I think it's a good addition. Yet another small part that I think is quite inconsequential is the updated visuals. I haven't played the original game, and I've seen a little bit on it, but it looks like a good game from the Plus version, but from what I remember, the OG game didn't look bad either. It definitely looks more cleaned up and crisp, but that's always a good thing, but it's not something I would want to sell you the game for. I'm not going to buy this version solely because of the graphic increase, but that's just me. Again, I haven't played a lot of the original, but I don't think it's that substantial to have it as a good selling point. So a very big difference from the OG game in this one is that it takes place inside of a virtual machine tailored mostly for the console release. You have your music player, your pictures, your files, and the quote-unquote game embedded within this machine, and that's how you play the game. Within this virtual machine, there's an email section as well, and it's not just for show to be like a part of your virtual desktop. Doing certain things within the game will trigger these cryptic emails being sent that expand heavily on the lore and twist that the game has. I think it's quite interesting, to be honest, and it even involves the side stories as well. It's quite the interesting way to convey more lore, and it definitely lends itself to being very mysterious as well. There's only a set number of emails, and again, they're not directly stating a lot of things. You have to inference a lot of things, but I think that's a lot of the fun that people have with this series and this game, is that a lot of it's speculation and theory, and that's what those emails and this expanded lore adds to the game. So yet another main grab of why you want to buy this version is that it's available on consoles now. Again, like I said, to accomplish this, they created a virtual machine, and honestly, it works quite well as a substitute for an actual computer. Obviously, it's not going to be the same as going into your real computer files to do stuff for the game and all that, but for immersion's sake, I think it's a quite creative alternative. I think you can suspend your reality long enough that the story and everything has an impact, and it's just cool playing the game on a console on a bigger screen and everything. Definitely a very good point of the game. So considering everything from the original game and the Plus version differences and all that, for my number score, I would give Doki Doki Literature Club Plus an 8.5 out of 10. It's a wonderful game. It deserved all the hype it got, and yeah, there's a couple minor things keeping it out of the masterpiece territory, but a very worthwhile game to play. Now, but that doesn't really fully answer the question, is the $15 Plus version actually worth it? I think it really depends on which demographic you fall into regarding your history of the game and what your taste in game is. If you've played the game before and liked it, I would say buy it. I mean, it's a good excuse to play the game again, you get some extra side stories, and you get an art book and a soundtrack. If you have a console and you want to play the game, I would recommend to buy the game. If you have a PC and you've never played the game before, I would recommend the $15 Plus version, but if you're skeptical if you would even like the game at all, or you just want to give it a try just because you want to try it and you don't think you'll have much of an investment into it, there's always the free version, which I would recommend in that case. Because obviously buying the $15 version with all the added gadgets, buttons, and side stories is still an option, but if you know your gameplay tastes and you're not too deep into visual novels, it's not your deal, and you have a PC, then I'd say go for the free version. Overall though, I'd recommend buying it to most people. The only people I'd say to not go for the $15 version are people who need to evaluate their tastes and say, I'm thinking about playing this game, but I'm not sure I'll even like it. So that does it for our very second episode of Is It Worth It? Should You Buy It? / game review type thing. Again, I gauge a lot of my content that I make based on reception and what people would recommend. So, leave those critiques in the comments and all that. And We out, gamers.